Great. So, good afternoon, everyone. I was going to say actually from sunny Kampala, but it has just changed to rainy Kampala. I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar that's been co-organized by the University of Birmingham, the Institute for Development Studies, the International Institute for Environment and Development, and the Institute for Housing and Development Studies. My name is Astrid. I'll be chairing today. I'm the manager of the International Growth Center's Cities That Work initiative. And as noted, joining from East Africa and looking forward to hearing the discussions around the cities that a lot of us who are on the call live and also work in. As a bit of background to this webinar, in 2017, the Department for International Development, East Africa Research Hub, funded 4 projects exploring development in East African cities. Whilst the thematic and geographic focus of each project is unique, the common theme underpinning all of them is that cities are complex and evolving systems. This webinar will provide an opportunity for each of the projects to discuss how they've engaged with this notion of cities as systems, and how this concept has informed their research. We look forward to 4 very exciting presentations, and then following this, a lively discussion. At any point during the presentations, please do feel free to type a question. If you note on the top right-hand side of your screen, there is a speech bubble that will open a chat function. You can type your questions in there, and we will collate the questions to then ask the presenters at the end of all of the presentations. Overall, the structure of today's webinar will be as follows. Each project that I will introduce shortly will be invited to make a 10-minute presentation. And after each presentation, I will provide a brief comment and highlight some potential areas for discussion. And then as noted, once all the presentations have been completed, we will have, hopefully by that point in time, somewhere between 45 minutes to an hour for discussion amongst all the participants on this webinar with the presenters. I just want to alert you that this webinar will be recorded for academic use. So without further ado, let me introduce the first presentation. And just to note that each of these projects has involved partnerships with other East African universities, civil society groups, and government bodies. Some of the co-researchers and participants who are actually represented on this call today. So the first presentation, and I would like to invite Gordon McGranahan from the Institute of Development Studies, who will be talking to us about the urban land nexus and inclusive urbanization in Dar es Salaam, Mwanza, and Khartoum. Gordon?
Hi, Gordon. I think you're currently self-muted, so if you unmute yourself, you should be able to present.
Yeah. Hi. Yes. So I'm presenting from the Institute of Development Studies. I think you should see the front page of my presentation in front of you. It basically, the presentation tries to do a bit of a combination of summarizing the project and its approach and some of the results with the perspective of cities as systems. You can see there the number of the collaborators. I won't go through them, but it's basically a lot of the field work in the cities has been led by Ardhi University in Tanzania, along with CCI, which is a more civil society group, and the University of Khartoum in Sudan. So, okay, so the challenge of the project is basically making urbanization more inclusive by acting on the urban land nexus. And it's based on the observation that there's a big gap between the international statements about the importance of inclusive urbanization and the reported patterns of spatial inclusion in a lot of cities and rapidly urbanizing countries. And the overarching proposition is basically that making urbanization more inclusive requires, among other things, identifying and implementing politically feasible changes in the planning and governance of the urban land nexus, which I'll explain what it is in a few minutes. But since I only have 10 minutes, I've structured it in 2 parts. The first part is on our conceptual approach to cities as systems, and I've tried to just pick out a few things So I'll look very briefly at the defining components of city systems as concentrations of people and their physical and social creations. And I'll look a bit at the concepts of agglomeration economies and the urban land nexus from a systems perspective. And those are two of the sort of overarching concepts around which we framed the proposal and the project. And look at informal settlement as an emergent property of certain late 20th and early 21st century systems. And I guess the point of describing it as an emergent property of systems is that it's not a simple outcome, and it's certainly not one that you can just turn off and on by switching from, let's say, from informal to formal settlement patterns through a policy shift. And then finally, I'll look a bit at preventing planetary gentrification as a sort of academic approach to some of these issues, and contrast that to its opposite, unleashing formal land markets, which they're popular, both are popular positions, heavily cited and published about, but really take up opposite recommendations. Then the last 5 minutes, I'm going to do a quick overview of Dar es Salaam based on some of the techniques we've used around mapping and case studies. And if there's time, do some contrasting examples of Khartoum, particularly focusing on the sites and services versus the informal settlement approaches, patterns in Dar es Salaam, and do some contrasting examples from Mwanza, in particular on water and sanitation. I suspect I may not get to those. So the defining components of city systems, and basically you can think of cities as concentrations of people in their physical and social creations. So that's people and their collective forms, enterprises, government agencies, informal groupings, and then the physical structures and infrastructures, and their productive, consumptive, and political and other activities. And the first systems proposition is that cities are complex and to a significant degree self-organizing, with multiple agents guided through a range of institutions, formal and informal, and with certain attributes of, so these cities have certain attributes of complex systems. The second proposition that relates also to the call is that in recent centuries, the economic advantages of cities have been central to their growth, and with political economic forces key to their evolution, hence the importance of political economy, which was a second sort of conceptual underpinning for the call that was made. So agglomeration in the urban land nexus, which is somewhat jargony, but there was a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, Alan Scott and Michael Storper, two of the most cited urban researchers in the US and in the UK, argued that agglomeration economies and the urban land nexus are two concepts that apply to all urban centers and should be accepted by all urbanists as part of their theoretical armory. And this caused a big stir and a lot of debate, and there's a special issue arguing against this, and they came back, and I'm not going to cover the debate. But I think it's important to recognize that there is that sort of debate going on. Now, the concept of agglomeration economies was at the core of the new urban economics, which emerged in the 1990s, and it essentially refers to the net economic benefits of urban agglomeration, the sort of coming together and spatial concentration of people and their things and productive activities. And from a systems perspective, you can see agglomeration economies as helping to explain the pull of the city to people and to enterprises, and more directly, the incentive to undertake productive activities in and around the city. And a couple of key points are that this pull of the city, according to this concept, it comes from the people, structures, and activities already in the city, not its inherent location. And secondly, that agglomeration economies affect people and activities, but depend on place. They're not directly traded through the market. And things like neighborhood effects are a local analog of agglomeration economies or diseconomies. And air pollution, which is one of the topics of one of the other of the consortia, air pollution concentrations are what you could call an agglomeration diseconomy. And in some ways, I think actually air pollution is an easier way of conceiving of some of these agglomeration economies and diseconomies than the more economic processes, which are actually people have harder problem grasping the nature of. But anyway, so urban land is people and physical structures and infrastructures as a result of this pulling together in particular spaces where they can't all act in the same place, come into contestation. And that's the concept of the urban land nexus centers on the contestation that takes place over location and space in this urban land nexus, where you have various positive and negative interdependencies, some related to markets, but many of them not related to markets. And this contestation can be alleviated, but there are strong tendencies towards the exclusion of or pollution of weaker or poorer groups. And this is very difficult to overcome entirely, but a lot can be done to ameliorate it. So the proposition is that agglomeration economies in the urban land nexus may not apply to all cities and need not be used by all urban scholars, but are particularly relevant to the cities of rapidly urbanizing countries. And I think this is somewhat contentious, but I'm not going to really try to defend it at this point. So then the second point about informal settlement is an emerging property of the late 20th and earliest 21st century city systems. So the term, very crudely, is used to refer to deprived settlements typically inhabited by low-income residents, urban residents, but it implies that these are settlements whose residences do not comply with formal regulations or standards. There's some disjunction and non-compliance there. And given our concern that a project with disadvantaged or excluded groups, we're particularly concerned with informal settlements whose residents cannot afford to comply with all the formal regulations without descending further into poverty. Now, the point I'm making here really is that we're not that concerned with what you could call the informality of wealthy groups who don't obey the formal rules and regulations either. This is a somewhat different phenomenon when it's people living with low enough incomes so that they really can't afford to achieve, rather than they're just working their way around the regulations. Now, it's often explained, and this is one of many explanations, but you'll see, but often explained as the result of excessively rapid urban population growth that local authorities cannot accommodate. I think this is a very misleading explanation, although there's, in a sense, at least some truth in it, and that equally one could explain informal settlements in these cities as the result of exclusionary measures designed to curb excessive urban population growth that local authorities don't want to accommodate. But from a systems perspective, and in terms of agglomeration economies and the land nexus, these two explanations and others overlap. And to achieve more inclusive urbanization, the obvious response is to make policies more capable of accommodating urban population growth, including that of low-income populations and disadvantaged groups, whether migrants or not. And the challenge is to ensure this is inclusive, economical, and politically feasible. So the other thing I was just going to bring up in this conceptual introduction is these two different ways of seeing the issues. There's preventing planetary gentrification, gentrification being something that was first conceptualized actually in London, that since has become this sort of planetary critique of wealthy people moving in, or the uses of land uses of wealthy people moving in and displacing poorer groups. And to contrast that with the notion that unleashing formal land markets is part of what's going to allow agglomeration economies to be captured, and that this will inevitably lead to the displacement of some people as part of a process that is tied up with economic growth. Now, within urban studies, these are two of major growth areas in the last couple of decades. And I put a chart showing the number of publications based on the Web of Science, which compares roughly to the number of publications about, under the topic like slum. And basically they've grown, particularly in recent years, and particularly the gentrification one. I think it's relevant and interesting that only 7 of these, really a couple of thousand in each, category, only 7 included in both categories. So there's very little actual communication across these two different approaches to looking at settlement and displacement in cities. Some key points I wanted to make is that urban spatial effects external to the market have been central to both the theory of the most cited critic of gentrification and to the leading economists using agglomerations to advocate formalizing land and property markets. Second, that they analyze spatial effects very differently, largely at different scales. So in the more economic agglomeration, it's a sort of net effect, it's the pull of the city, whereas in terms of gentrification, it's much more a neighborhood effect, which is affected by this churn of the city. But both sides, I think it's interesting and rather typical of the state of debate, is that both sides would be inclined to dismiss the other as ideological claptrap, not worth taking seriously. Whereas I think actually in neglecting what the other side emphasizes, both are in a sense only seeing part of the system. So I'm going to turn to the maps and the case studies. Do let me know when I get to the last couple of minutes. But so this is some of the work we did looking at the population and how it.
Sorry, I think you had just 2 or 3 more minutes.
2 or 3 more minutes. Okay. So here's the map of Dar es Salaam, and you can see if the expansion of that population between 2000 and 2012. And you have on the map the number of the case studies we undertook, the locations. You can also see we've gathered information digitized on the evolution of settlement type. This is planned areas is the sort of tiger stripe, and the other 2 pink and pale yellow are informal settlements at different levels of consolidation. You can see that changing over time. And also we've done syntax analysis looking at relative integration or segregation of different areas, and we've put in the more segregated areas in the final map that shows that that's basically covers some of the less consolidated unplanned areas, very few of the planned areas, and also more undeveloped areas. And then if you look at here, we also looked at these different population density, accessibility, and residential land value as estimated for government purposes. And you can see the relationships and explore the relationships between them. Then in terms of the case study processes, again, these are the case study locations, the sort of case studies we did. You can see Kigamboni there, I've marked out here, there's a proposed new town. And you can see if you look at the center of the city in terms of relative segregation, spatial segregation, it's an area that's segregated, but they're putting in new infrastructure, and the whole idea, you can see the logic of trying to make it into a new town because it was relatively isolated, but it's going to become more integrated. Land prices are going to get higher. You can try to take control of a large swathe of land, but actually they've had problems. It's been delayed. It doesn't look like it's going ahead. And just to go through, so there's also resettlement, and you can see that an attempt to resettle, the case study was related to flooding, but people are being pushed out. Completely different type of location in the settlement, having all sorts of problems with that. On the other hand, there is spontaneous settlement, very different phenomenon, not led by the poorest groups, but much more by aspiring and relatively up and coming lower middle class households going out to the outskirts and setting up, before the services come, buying plots, setting up settlements. Some of which, and you can see there's attempts to regularize these, and there's a regularization process, which is basically an attempt to formalize these processes and make them more part of the city. I don't have time to go into the details, but there's also an informal self-building process where we looked at at 2 levels of consolidation, a gentrification process, which turned out to be largely led by commercialization and was where the land issues became particularly conflictive around the different uses of land and their conflicts with each other, the way in which one use conflicted with another. And then I'll stop now, but just to say that basically, if you look at Khartoum and Dar es Salaam, both of them are very rapidly growing primate cities of their country. Sudan is somewhat wealthier, and they have, and the last figure I'll show, but I could go through the much more if there had been time, is part of the big difference is Khartoum is a much more planned, at least at the level of the structure of the city, and you can see that already in the pattern, the gridded pattern on the right versus where large parts of the population live in Dar es Salaam in the much more informal and non-gridded structures, which has implications for what can be done in the future, what the current situation is, and we basically have been looking at that process, and I'm not going to take you through, but they're basically a series of case studies, and also we've done mapping around things like the water systems and the infrastructure and how that fits in, and how the patterns are not always the obvious ones, and trying to explain those patterns and work out how it can move towards a more inclusive process. Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I will keep my comments brief so that we have some discussion at the end. And these are just sort of open comments for reflection that you may or may not want to respond to later. Can I just remind everyone on the call, if you think of questions during the presentations, please do type them up in the chat function, because we'll be collecting questions as we go through. Gordon, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I caveat my comments now and probably all my comments to come with the fact that I am an economist working with Collier and Professor Collier and Professor Venables, so probably come from that angle. But I think what I really appreciated in your definition of agglomeration economies is that you actually provided a very open definition that included aspects like people and services, and not just sort of the firm side, which us as economists tend to focus on when we think about agglomeration economies. That being said, sort of like bringing the pieces together that you noted, particularly in the form of informal settlements, you highlighted some reasons why informal settlements, or some theories about why informal settlements come about. For example, that it may be local government does not want to accommodate or cannot accommodate. But I think from an economics perspective, it's this challenge we have in a lot of East African cities, which is that the agglomeration economies that we tend to see in cities in more developed countries through firms are not coming, and so the tax base and the finance isn't there to be able to actually build housing, either from a private or from a public perspective. And I think, sort of bringing this together with the urban land nexus as you did, I think a very key component is obviously the very complex land tenure systems that exist. Coming from a city where we have 5 land tenure systems in one city, that's sort of also part of the reason, both preventing agglomeration economies, but also fostering sort of more informal settlements, or not fostering the informal settlements, but not allowing them to sort of unleash their potential. And so in terms of, the case studies you presented, it would be good, again, in the discussion period, if you have time to, to hear a little bit more about this question of land tenure in the different cities that you looked at, and where this fits in. And then finally, you started with a sort of a framing of the presentation within the concept of inclusive urbanization. And interestingly, a colleague of mine just wrote a blog in which he said, if you were to ask 5 economists about what their definition is of inclusive growth or inclusive urbanization, you'd have 1 or 2 responses. You'd either have 5 responses or you'd have a silent room. And so it would be really interesting to hear, when you talk of inclusive urbanization, what your conceptualization is, and also particularly within the sort of cities as a systems framework that you presented. But those are just a couple of reflections, and as I said, I encourage everyone, please, to put your own questions in the chat. But without further ado, let me invite David Satterthwaite from the International Institute for Environment and Development, who will be presenting on a project on the shelter provision in East African cities and understanding transformative politics for inclusive cities. David?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? And is my PowerPoint on the screen?
We can hear you, but I don't see the PowerPoint. It should hopefully appear soon.
We can share it from this side if that's more convenient for you. Okay, bear with us 1 second. Perhaps you can do your introductory comments and then there we go. That should be popping up just now.
Do I need to tell you when to change?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Okay, this should start with the PowerPoint saying what is sought at the top.
Yeah.
What we're interested in is trying to get a citywide understanding of low-income groups' struggle to find or afford accommodation, recognizing that this is within both the formal and the informal land and housing markets and influenced by government policies, practices, or lack of policies and practices. We also then have a stronger basis for understanding how to improve housing conditions in these groups, especially those in informal settlements. Can you change the slide, please? Cities as systems, we can look at cities as systems with many interacting elements or constituent parts. And clearly they include a lot of other systems, investment flows, labor markets, housing and land for housing markets, and infrastructure. As Gordon commented, cities are generally open systems as investment, resources, goods and population can flow in and out, although many governments have tried to restrict or control in migration to cities. Next slide. But we can also look at things like housing markets or land markets or infrastructure or labor markets as systems in their own right, and so they become the key systems on which cities build. And of course, taking a city perspective also means we've got to look at city-region interactions, especially for those goods or services that are very much drawn from the periphery outside the city boundaries. For instance, in all three cities we're looking at, there's a lot of informal settlements outside city boundaries. Next slide. We can also look at cities as part of other systems. For instance, how social and political systems shape city land markets, shape housing markets, shape infrastructure provision. We can look at cities as elements in larger systems. All the global cities literature, for instance, does this. So you're looking at beyond city boundaries, at regional, national, or global systems. And of course, all cities exist within a changing climate, and climate change that the cities are generally contributing to. We can also recognize that cities are underpinned by natural systems on which they draw, and which they change and usually damage. Next slide. One of the difficulties for anyone looking at housing issues is how little official data there is. National sample surveys, such as the demographic and health surveys, have immense detail about many indicators, but the sample size is too small to give us data for individual cities, even less districts within cities, which is what we need. Censuses can do this. Censuses should do this. They should be providing each local government and each ward and borough or district government with lots of interesting details and data on housing. But many countries haven't had a census in 10 or 15 years. We also notice that it may be informal settlements are being completely bypassed. Official data gatherers are frightened to go into informal settlements. They also have no maps generally, and it's very difficult to do a household survey without any maps. So we're very limited in the amount of data we have on cities. The next slide. And we have this paradox that you keep coming back to. City economies and government departments depend on low-income workers and service providers, but the formal system does not provide accommodation for them. I mean, we have some of this debate about key workers in this country, but we're looking at a scale of 40, 50, 60, 70% of a city population excluded from formal housing systems. In the end, they usually turn to buying, building, or renting informal housing, as we can see at scale in Nairobi, Hawassa, and Mogadishu. So how are housing choices made? In choosing where to live and under what terms, individuals and households make choices based on so many needs and so many preferences, balanced against what is available and what can be afforded. They often choose dangerous sites, floodplains, alongside rivers, steep slopes, because these are the only good locations in terms of accessing labor markets and services, but they're too dangerous to be attractive to developers. In looking at informal housing in these three cities, also beginning to look at the formal housing system, we got some interesting surprises. Nairobi has roughly 200,000 people living in multi-story tenements built by private enterprises that are kind of halfway between formal and informal, and are proving an important source of quite poor quality, very crowded accommodation for lower middle income groups. We also discover in Hawassa the debate about dormitories, and it's funny, dormitories have not been seen as a formal housing solution except in China for many years. Now there's a new debate and discussion whether governments should be developing dormitories. If we think of all the, it's difficult to encapsulate the services that housing provides us with, but the housing that we have provides us with a safe structure, with access to sanitation and water, privacy, living space, electricity, affordable cost, access roads, regular safe water pipe to each plot, drainage, connection to electricity grid, emergency services when we need it, solid waste collection. Sorry, are you keeping up with the slides?
Sorry.
So now we got housing needs delivered to neighborhood at the top. If we just go, just quickly flip through those three slides again. Housing needs in-house. Housing needs delivered to house.
Yeah.
And housing needs delivered to neighborhood. It gives us an idea of the range of services that housing provides for us. Much of the informal settlements we work in the three cities are illegal. So a legal address is usually what is needed for accessing so many services and entitlements. In many cities, you don't get on the voters' register without it. You don't get postal services. You don't get access to many public services, for instance, getting your kids into government schools or government health care. In many countries, key social entitlements are not valid if you haven't got a legal address. And of course, access to insurance, access to bank accounts, access to housing finance usually is not available. And one of the factors, among several, is the lack of a legal address. And of course, a legal address is a key defense against eviction threats. We don't usually think of these as housing issues. So this should have us a heading implication.
Yeah.
So low-income groups are not getting most of these services from their house. They have to rely on many different informal service providers, water vendors, latrine cleaners, garbage removers. This is more expensive in total and with worries about quality and of convenience. Or low-income groups simply go without. And there was a recent study in Dar es Salaam as to how many pit latrines are overflowing because it's expensive and difficult to get them cleaned. This slide should say the remarkable range of services on the top.
Yeah.
Also a reminder that good location within a city is a key attribute of housing needed by low-income groups. Also a legal address, and we don't usually discuss good location and legal address as housing issues. Next slide. City governments may be weak, but they can still make important contributions to improving housing through provision for land and tenure, support for informal processes, large-scale slum and squatter upgrading, providing addresses and its importance for accessing services, changing inappropriate housing and land rules and regulations. You know, you get these ridiculous minimum plot sizes, 4 to 10 times what they should be. And of course, expanding road and public transport networks, which brings more land and more land for housing into the range of the main labor markets. So it's interesting, governments are not building houses, but they're acting to reduce system constraints on which housing depends: land, infrastructure, services, public transport, and voice. Two ways to address these issues. Sorry, this is a slide that says that at the top, 2 ways to address these issues. I hope you're seeing the same slides as me.
Yeah.
We can present solutions for informal settlements drawing on examples from other countries and context. We usually have to rely on the very government that to date has been so ineffective to do the implementation. And we often get wildly unrealistic suggestions that work in South Korea are not going to work in Somalia. Also, the success stories we look at very often are the result of long political struggles, which we haven't made note of. So, in Mogadishu and in Nairobi, giving clear land tenure, allocating land to benefit low-income groups would do much to improve housing conditions. But look at the political unfeasibility of these. I noticed Gordon's comment twice talking about we've got to look at what is politically feasible locally. And in Mogadishu, the chance of an equitable, inclusive urbanization over land is a very distant hope. In Nairobi too, much of the public land has been captured by private individuals with support of corrupt officials. All of us working in cities, well, I think most of us working in cities with very rapid growth in land prices, and of course very powerful real estate interests, often operating outside the law. This is a slide saying second way to address these issues. Another way is in each city to learn how low-income groups actually get housing through purchase, through building, through renting, or through otherwise occupying. To understand how these are located within the existing land and housing finance and infrastructure systems. Working to locally negotiated solutions, working with low-income groups and their organizations to develop solutions that are specific to each settlement and the needed partnership with local government. Identify groups that face more difficulties in getting housing, for instance, those suffering discrimination in access to land or housing by gender or social group, or who simply lack the contacts with for those who can open more possibilities for housing. We have a wonderful living example of this in our Nairobi case study. This is the example of Mukuru. Mukuru is an enormous informal settlement, or actually, strictly speaking, an agglomeration of villages, 101,000 households. The Kenyan Homeless People's Federation has been given the task of actually working with government support to develop an upgrading program. And that is negotiating local solutions in each village that makes up Mukuru. One of the critical innovations is a local fund in Nairobi, the Akiba Mashinani Trust, that has the funds to provide households with loans. They've covered 7,000 households with loans for upgrading, and supported so many community-led upgrading initiatives with Muungano, the Kenyan Homeless People's Federation. So what happens in these? The first thing that Mungano did was to walk everywhere, to go to every village, to go to every community, to develop a basic plan for Mukuru, and then this then serves as the basis for discussing what to do in each location. And then this moves to a consolidated map such as this. Okay, folks, I think that's it. I'm sorry about the confusion with the slides.
Okay.
Thank you very much, David. That was a very fascinating presentation. I think from my side, my comments are I'm struck by how perhaps you already in your presentation referred to sort of comments that Gordon made, but there's actually sort of some overlap that I see between sort of Gordon's conceptualization of the cities as a system between this urban land nexus and agglomeration economies. And I think you highlighted particularly two ways which these two things interact. And one is an address system, which really allows people to access and benefit from agglomeration economies, and perhaps to use a word that has also been used in conjunction with agglomeration economies, to unleash them. And then the second part is, excuse me, how you noted that location is really important. I think there's a number of studies from different developing countries that look at this housing question, where they note the trade-off where people are willing to trade off housing quality for a good location. It's also, you also brought in this question of climate change, and I think particularly when we're talking about East African cities, one thing that we always have to bear in mind is this interaction with the natural environment, because in conjunction with the rapid urbanization that many of these cities are facing, they're doing so in a climate-constrained environment. So gone are the days where we can build big factories and pollute. And I think this question of quality of location and the interaction with the natural environment is then very important, as you noted, because people then tend to locate on wetlands and other areas that then have other impacts for the city. I was struck by your comment that governments don't build houses, particularly because one of your case studies came from Ethiopia, and not in Hawassa, I know, but in Addis Ababa, obviously there's this massive government public housing scheme that is going on. And for reasons you mentioned, which is that people tend to prefer location over quality, and because governments where they have tried to provide public housing haven't been able to do so at the speed, for whatever reason, financial constraint and others, as the population desires, public housing schemes tend to have failed, because then people will rent out wherever house or formal house they get and move back into more slum-like settlements or informal settlements nearer to where they can access jobs. So, it would be very, very interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And I like, the conclusions that you come to, that, it really comes down to local solutions. And you talked about the mapping that is going on in Kenya. And then sort of the other thing that always fascinates me, or that strikes me, particularly here in informal settlements in Kampala, is that someone knows how to build a house that is affordable, that people are willing to rent out. And how can we incentivize them to build better houses that are still affordable, that people can rent out? Because there is a market for this somewhere. And how do we rather than think big, how do we support these local solutions that are sort of already popping up in many of these cities everywhere? I note that there's already some questions coming up. Thank you for the people who've posed questions. We'll collate these, and I invite the presenters also to have a read through the chat and look at the questions. And if anything sort of from my comments strikes you as interesting as well, to respond to this in the discussion section. But before we get to the overall discussion, we still have two more presentations. So I now invite John Bryson from the University of Birmingham, who's going to talk about a systems approach to air pollution in East Africa. John, are you there?
Yes, I am here. So,
Great.
So I've taken a very different approach, because the topic of this webinar, an integrated or systemic approach to city regions, is something I've been working on for the last 30 years. And what I've been doing over the last 30 years is developing a layered understanding to city regions that incidentally started with a reading of Alan Scott's very early book entitled The Urban Land Nexus and the State, and then has gone through a whole series of different projects, with each project focusing on a very different layer of city regions, with the ultimate object of trying to develop a very complex understanding of something that is an evolving 30-year, 40-year project. Some of this came together in an edited book that I published late last year on reading city regions, and a lot of my presentation comes from the opening and concluding chapters of that particular book. So the first thing we need to note, and the first two presentations have done this, is city regions are complex. So what we have is the city region is not a single place, it's not a single city, it's not a single village, it's an amalgam of very many different types of place. And each place will have a slightly different function, a slightly different role, a slightly different history. City regions, they grow, they begin to embrace other places that are co-located to them, but they also embrace places that aren't co-located. So we have linkages between different places that are not within a city region, but are very closely connected to that city region. So we shouldn't just focus our understanding of a city region on that which is co-located in a defined geography. We need to understand the connections that city region has with other places. So what we have is a view of a city region as a complex mosaic of very different types of place. And that mosaic is dynamic, it's evolving, it's changing all the time. Linked to that, we need to think about a city region as a set of assets. Now, those assets are partly about people, they're partly about infrastructure, they're partly about buildings, they're partly about connections. So my primary definition of a city region, which builds upon Gordon's definition of your people and physical and social creations, I would have to add connectivity and connections into that particular definition. So what we have is intra-city region connections and inter-city region connections, and each of those connections represents flows. Flows of things, flows of ideas, flows of knowledge, flows of people, flows of funding, flows of money, flows of political influence. So what we have is a city region, a view of a city region as a set of layers. And within each of those layers, we have simultaneously process of creation as new layers are added to the mix, as existing layers are changed. And we also have ongoing processes of destruction, sometimes destruction for destruction's sake, and sometimes processes of creative reconstruction. Now, if we think about the complexity of a city region economy, what I've been working on for the last 30 years is perhaps best defined in this slide. So what is the object of study of a city region economy? So what we've heard thus far today is agglomerations, urban land, to try and understand some of the complexities of city regions, try and prevent gentrification. And then we've seen the alternative focus on housing and shelter provision and developing a different approach to dysfunctionality within the provision of housing within city regions. So for me, city regions, we can, as a researcher or as a policymaker, we can focus on a regional-based approach or a firm-based approach. We can focus on an individual-based approach. We can focus on an agglomeration approach. We can focus on an entrepreneurial-based approach. We can small and medium-sized businesses and informal enterprises. We can focus on the role of international business. All of these reflect different ways of entering a city region. But the danger is most academics tend to focus on one particular angle. So at the moment, there's a big debate on financialization, but the debate on financialization tends to ignore all the other elements of a city region. The debate on agglomeration overemphasizes the importance of agglomeration and fails to acknowledge that if we follow particular firms, successful firms over time tend to remove themselves from the local agglomeration. So they tend to develop relationships with other industries and other firms and other individuals based in other places. They still remain located in their existing location, but that existing location becomes less important. So we published a paper on that process of becoming disembedded earlier this year with one of my former research fellows, Jacob Solder, following 50 firms. All of those 50 firms, bar one, had no local clients and no local inputs from the city region in which those firms were located. All of those had been dispersed into other places, mostly beyond the nation state in which that city region was located. So agglomerations are only part of the story. There's also a process of disagglomeration as individuals and firms develop different geographies and different understandings of place and space. Now, David's presentation highlighted the importance of not just focusing on city regions, but to move beyond this. And we need to move beyond the city region to other places. So I've just come back from holiday, and I've been on the coast of North Norfolk, and here are some of my holiday slides. Now, what's going on in Birmingham and London and Newcastle at the moment is partly impacted by what's going on the coast of North Norfolk, because 30% of the gas that enters the UK comes from the Bacton gas terminal. That Bacton gas terminal, unless there is an effective process of sea defence, is going to disappear into the North Sea, or the former German Sea, over the next 5 or 10 years. So at the moment, what's just happening is a £25 million project to put in place 1.8 million cubic meters of sand that's been lifted up from the ocean bed and placed on the beach. A Dutch company to develop a local solution to ensure that London and Birmingham and Newcastle are still able to consume gas within their local households. So where does the boundary of a city region start and stop? Well, it depends on what the research question you are looking at is trying to achieve, but the likelihood is going to take you slightly beyond the dimensions of the administrative boundary of a city region. So Birmingham's linked to Bacton, which the majority of Birmingham residents won't be aware of, and the majority of London residents will not be aware of. So if we think about city regions as systems of systems, where I'm currently focusing on is thinking about consumption. So every act of consumption, every movement across the territory of action involves some form of energy exchange, some form of financial exchange, some form of interaction. So if you think of all cities, anything that goes on comes back to some process of consumer decision-making. And that process of consumer decision-making may occur in each individual household. So there we're dealing with trillions upon trillions of decisions that we as academics mostly don't understand because we don't look at that particular scale of analysis. And each of those household decisions to consume will involve trade-offs, complex trade-offs, where they can spend money in one way or spend money in another way. And those trade-offs will also reflect the ways in which they're using city regions, the way in which they're negotiating access to city region assets, and the way in which they're dealing with time and space. So what we need to be thinking of is a continual complex interplay between household and firm expenditure, all of that linking back into consumptions of energy, producing dysfunctionality and functionality. So we've already highlighted the diseconomies that come from agglomerations linked to air pollution. There are a whole series of other diseconomies that come from agglomeration economies. So consumption for me becomes more and more important in trying to understanding the ways city regions evolve. And here you have another one of my holiday slides. Now this is Norwich Cathedral. So last week, if you visited Norwich Cathedral, you found a helter-skelter in the cathedral, and that helter-skelter was attracting 100 people to slide down it every hour. If you wanted to actually slide down that helter-skelter, you had to be in the cathedral by around 10:30 in the morning, because all tickets were sold out every day by 10:30. And that image of the helter-skelter was taken from the cathedral shop, which is also in the nave of the cathedral. So that example of Norwich Cathedral highlights that the cathedral plays many different functions and roles within the city. It's a function of providing services of last resort to the homeless and to those in special need within the city. It's a place of ceremony. It's a place, last week, of great fun and entertainment, and people who would normally not visit a cathedral, visiting it to pay £2 to go down a helter-skelter ride. So we have this complex layering within cities each of those layers has something to do with consumer decision making. So the city region as a system of systems, one of the books I discovered about 15 years ago was a book written about the city of Sheffield, published in 1913. And in this book, we have this amazing statement on page 1, which is talking about firms and trade. But what it argues is that if we're going to study a particular trade within a city in isolation from other trades, all we're going to get is a partial analysis. And it would be like extracting a single thread from a woven tapestry. So all we see is the thread, and we wouldn't see the tapestry. So what we need to do is place that trade we're trying to focus on within its wider, within the wider fabric of industrial life. So for me, that sort of summarizes the need for developing a systems of systems approach to city regions. So if we're focusing on housing, that's a single thread. So you have to place that single thread within the wider complexity of the city region. If we're focusing on air pollution, we've got to again place that into the wider complex set of systems that are going on within that city region and beyond the city region. So that type of approach is a major policy challenge, and it's a major academic challenge, because in policy terms and in academic terms, we tend to be forced down particular silos of thought. So here we have our housing department, here we have our department of enterprise or industry, here we have our department of planning. They tend to be very, very separate departmental functions. In the same way, within a university setting, you'll have academics who focus on air quality, academics who focus on housing, academics who focus on agglomeration, and there'll be limited intellectual exchange between those different debates. But ultimately, if they're working within the context of a city region, all of those debates should be connected in a whole series of interesting and complex ways. So within our city region, we have, and this mirrors Gordon's definition of a city region, we have hard infrastructure. So you're using this concept of physical creations. So the roads, the pavements, the airports, the ports, the engineered structures. Those reflect investment decisions made mostly by dead people, people who are no longer with us. And then we have ongoing alterations and developments with that infrastructure about those who are currently alive, that are going to leave legacies for those future generations that are to come. And then you have this notion of social creations, or the soft infrastructure, people-based systems, including education and health. Now, one of the things I'm interested in is being very wary of the notion of a system of systems as something that is functional. Because in most cases, we're dealing with soft systems that suffer from bounded rationality. So we have great degrees of irrational behavior. We have lots of asymmetry in terms of access to knowledge, access to information going on. So you have lots of irrational decision-making going on with very little rational decision-making going on. So what we need to do is think about dysfunctionality and the way in which certain elements of dysfunctionality might actually be perfectly functional. And we shouldn't assume that our systems of systems are going to produce rational, functional outcomes, because there's no reason why such functionality and such rationality should ever exist. So one of the things that you'll see from some of my recent work is a focus on trying to develop an approach about reading city regions. So there are a series of books that were published recently about seeing cities, or Seeing Like a City by Amin and Thrift. So I argue against that, saying that what we need to do is understand how we can read a city region. And when I'm reading a city region, one of the things I'm initially interested in is the city region as an accumulation of assets that have accumulated over hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. So we have to develop an historical understanding of our city regions. We then have an accumulation of connections, some of those connections being of the now, some of those connections having their origins back in the distant past. We then need to be thinking about the interrelationships between soft infrastructures and hard infrastructures. We need to be aware of financial flows, some of them producing all sorts of dysfunctionality and perverse consequences within our cities. And then we need to be focusing on consumers versus and households versus firms, third sector and public service decision makers within our cities. And then we have this interdependencies between investments and assets. Now, a key question is, why is one city different to another? Because every city region is distinctively different. How do we understand that? And what we're then looking at is the bundle of layers that are combined together at a particular place, and what is inimitable from that collection of interactions and from that bundling that is going on within a particular place. Now, some of that inimitability is seen within the stories that are told of a particular city region, some of those stories being negative, some of those stories being positive, some of those stories being media creations, some of those stories being created by corporates and the private sector, some of those being political stories, and some of them emerging from a whole series of different origins, some of them very much with their origins back in the past. So we need to be thinking about inimitability and the layering of particular assets. Now, some of the work that's been going on within the ASAP East Africa project has been focusing on air pollution. What we've been working on is the way in which households within informal settlements can engage in alternative substitution behavior. So they're producing alternatives to accessing services that are just not available to them. These are services in which there is no local alternative provision. So what we're seeing is an alternative system based on alternative provision. But what's interesting is if you trace that approach to the provision of services that you would normally get, building on David's presentation, from your house, the normal services you get from a fully developed, fully sort of functional house. These households in informal settlements are trying to develop alternative substitution solutions to these services. If we go back to the UK in the 19th century, that was quite common. That was a common way of providing household services because those household services were not commonly available. So what we're seeing in many of our East African cities is an alternative solution to system failure. But that system failure also occurred in economies that are now deemed to be more developed, but we're looking at solutions that were occurring 100 years or 150 years or 200 years. Or if you look across the United Kingdom, there are certain villages in which they're unable to access broadband services. So some of those, 80 of those villages have developed local alternatives. They've dug the trenches, they put in the infrastructure in place themselves, they put in place a management system to develop local broadband companies. It's an alternative solution to a service that they deem they need, that is not provided by the private sector or currently by the public sector. So that's the end of my presentation. So from this you get a view that builds upon the first two presentations of complexity. I add to the first two presentations this notion of connectivity, understanding local connections and understanding connections between city regions, this notion of layering and reading city regions, and focusing on consumer behavior and the decisions that individuals and households make, and firms and the public services, and the trade-offs that sit within some of the decision-making focuses, and a call for much more research and understanding those processes of decision-making. And I appreciate that understanding those processes is going to be really complex, because a lot of what we're dealing with is not completely rational and is going to exhibit a whole series of issues to do with bounded rationality and information asymmetry. And a lot of what we're dealing with is reflecting choice-based decisions. And for many of the people we're working with in our East African cities, we're dealing with households in which there is no choice, or very limited choice. End of my presentation.
Thank you very much, John. I like how you've already started to connect the sort of concepts between your presentation and the previous two presenters, and sort of really brought in this concept of dynamism and connectivity. I think for a lot of the cities we're talking about, there's this notion that there's still a lot of impermanence in the cities. There's a rural-urban migration, but there's a lot of urban-rural migration as well. People particularly flow back and forth. And it kind of links to the concepts that, you know, David and Gordon were talking about, which is, you know, informal settlement and housing. For example, here in Kampala, a lot of people have a house in the city, which may be an informal settlement, but they'll still have a home in their rural area, and come to the city to access services and access jobs. But this question of this sort of the dynamic question and the sort of back and forth flow, I mean, I've taken people as an example, but you could take goods as well, brings to this question that you touched upon, but you know, if you would like to sort of elaborate and expand on it in the discussion, which is within this concept of the city region, how do we define the boundary, right? So when you have such dynamic movements and when you have such sort of dynamic expansion, where is the boundary? Is it defined sort of using your terms as the hard and soft infrastructure? But even that, how does one define what is the sort of entity of study and entity of consideration? I also like the fact that you brought out the challenge that we have when it comes to urban research overall, which is, and that we're probably most of us on the Kahola are guilty of, which is this very siloed nature of the research. I'd like to expand that as well to say it's a challenge with urban policy making too. For many of the cities that I work in, the challenge is that you know, one ministry is responsible for education, another ministry is responsible for health, and a third ministry is responsible for industry. But the city has to deal with all of those different factors. And how does one even overcome this siloed nature within policy making? And I think this is going to be a very sort of relevant link between sort of the cities as a systems research done at an academic level and how it can be sort of linked to a policy level. And then sort of finally, I wanted to touch upon your sort of, I guess your last couple of slides on this question of assets. And you talked about cities sort of being long-term accumulations of assets, sometimes thousands of years. And I do see this, for example, I do see this as an argument for cities, for example, in the UK or in Europe or in North America more broadly. But I wonder whether, you know, this notion is actually being challenged now in some of the cities that we're working in, and that actually what we're seeing is the sort of the speed and accumulation of, you know, a rapid accumulation of short-term assets. Many of these cities are relatively new, and actually 2/3 of the cities, you know, it's estimated that 2/3 of the urbanization is still meant to take place before 2040. So many of these cities are still to come. And whether this sort of short and, you know, rapid accumulation of assets is really one of the challenges we face, because often, you know, for policymakers, what they're doing is trying to retrofit a city where people are already based, whereas, you know, where you have a more longer term accumulation of assets and a sort of more broadly defined urbanization path, and also in a more static environment, this may, you know, this can take time and can then adapt. But I do sort of bring this back to your point, which I think is a very valid point of sort of where do we see these alternate solutions to these sort of systemic failures. So with those few comments, I will now turn to the last presenter, who I hope now has made it onto the call, Alex Gaffney from the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies, talking about spatial inequality and the timings of urban transition and the complex land markets in Uganda and Somaliland. Alex, are you there? Are you potentially on mute?
I know he's unmuted, so he should be able to talk. Alex, can you hear us?
You very well.
Oh, perfect. Yeah,
but I can't.
Excellent.
Hi, Alex.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Okay, wait for that.
If you click the share screen.
I try to share the screen with you right now.
Let's see.
But it isn't. There it is. Okay. Yes. Can you see that?
Perfect. Yeah.
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 Perfect. Okay, yeah, thanks very much for inviting me to this very inspiring talk. And also, yeah, I think some of the things that have been said, I will repeat. Others I might challenge a bit. I try to. What I'd like to share with you first is quite an extensive presentation of our whole research, but don't be afraid, I will not go through all the details. I just found it interesting to start really discussing a bit what we have done as a research group, and we are IP 999, DPU from London, and two local partners that shamefully enough don't appear on this slide is Makerere University from Uganda, Act Together Uganda, and Red Sea from Somaliland. What we did is we worked on complex land markets and how these can be related to spatial justice that are in the current urban transition in East Africa in these two countries. I mentioned Uganda and Somaliland. We, of course, had the whole understanding of, or we tried to develop a whole understanding, a complex understanding of the city as system. And a bit in addition to what I said before, so from the macro perspective as city regions and cities that are elements of a global system, we very much looked into how cities work as systems within it. Like what is the system producing? Because we talk a lot about input and outputs inputs and outcomes from cities, like population flowing into the city, making different things as in informal settlements, or creating maybe also new economies out of just the agglomeration they are a part of. But we also had the understanding that systems have emergence with a T at the end. Sorry for my bad pronunciation. Emergence as defined as something that comes out if you put two elements together. And complex land markets for us is such an emergent. If there is a social interaction between a buyer and a seller, and maybe some kind of government or broker or traditional chief engagement, this creates a new institution, and this new institution is a complex land market. And this institution, of course, has its own products. So we talk about something that is developed out of a situation that is very urban bound in some way or the other, in the meaning that we will have very different rural land markets and urban land markets. And that is mainly because people coming into cities, they seek some place for shelter, and they seek all kinds of land tenureships. And just to take one of our findings up front, we have found out that land titling, as it has been promoted for long, as a solution into formality, and I think David mentioned that it actually is not so attractive to a certain part of populations, and that is, for example, female occupiers of land, because they know that by formalizing they will get into a different category that they cannot really afford. So if we talk about the possibility of having land in the city and how to access this land in the city, we automatically have to talk about the options and the possibilities of different people, different segments of society to access this land and the complexity within it, which then relates to what we call spatial justice, as also redefined a bit by us, but based on the traditional, if we may say so, the traditional concepts on spatial justice, which means there is distributive and there is God, I should know this. I'm writing this like every day. Distributive and procedural justice as two elements that form the concept of spatial justice, and we tried to develop this into an index. We have been working on a number of different research methods, or with different research methods. We did spatial assessments. We did, of course, analysis of context and land markets. We did a profound household survey in 4 cities. In these 4 cities, We also looked into the biography of land transactions, and we are now working on the comparative analysis to better understand what we can conclude in general for Uganda, Somaliland, if there is lessons to be learned. Though also very clearly there is a lot of difference between the different land markets and the different societies, as you all can very well imagine. And we are trying to develop a spatial justice index. So just to start a bit with the spatial assessment, but not going very much into detail, this is actually a very concluding, very illustrative map of Hargeisa, the historic growth since 1972.
Alex, just
say?
I'm not sure your presentation's moving through the slides. We're still on the title page.
Oh, really? Oh, sorry. I don't know why that's happening.
I could also show your slides from this side, if that's more convenient.
Okay, but I cut a few out. Can you not see that? Let me check.
That's better, yeah. I think perhaps an update. Perhaps go to presentation. Do you have two screens? Because that may be why.
No.
Oh, perhaps
I share my screen again.
Go to presentation.
Okay.
Hopefully work.
Can you see it now?
We're on the slide that says how we propose to answer this question.
Yes, very good. Okay, so you can see that too? I changed?
No. If you forward your slides to me quickly, I can pull it up on my...
Okay.
If that helps.
Yeah, or we can. I can just tell you if you start share, and because my email is always delayed. Just open my PDF that I sent to you, and then I can start talking about what we see. William?
Yeah, I'm just going to put it down.
Okay, great.
There we go. Perfect. And I will share the screen.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Okay. If you can scroll down a bit more.
Yeah.
That was maybe just to go through that because I explained them, but yeah. Anyways, okay. Let's go there. Land markets. Well, the analysis, no, actually, that's really the long version. If you can scroll through this, please. Shall I try again with sharing my screen, if I can understand how that works? Okay. I can share my entire screen. Let me try this. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, that seems to be working. Try clicking next.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's working.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
The slides, yeah.
Okay. Right. Good. So that was a research question. How do complex land markets influence spatial justice? These are our different work packages, and I was just talking about this spatial situation of Hargeisa, the historic growth since 1972, which very much illustrates the level of growth, and actually interesting also to compare the different cities and their specific growth level. This Hargeisa has been grown actually not so much anymore since 2017 in a, of course, shorter time frame, but there is a certain consolidation, which is not the case in the other cities. So what we did to better understand these different cities and to be able to compare them, we had different typologies, calling it type A typology, the ones that were the better off residential area, so to say, down to type D. And you can see in the percentage here that, yeah, of course, the population, for example, of type A is only 8% of the total population of the city, but they occupy 33% of residential areas, etc. So not very surprising, because land is not only a status symbol, but also the amount of land that you own. defines your social status and your participation in the local economy. This is again, I will not explain everything. This is just to show a bit how these different typologies worked, and actually that they are very comparable. If you look at Hargeisa and then Berbera, you would see that though Berbera is a much smaller secondary city in Somaliland, the typology is actually quite comparable. While in Kampala, you would see that we had to diversify our typology a lot, mainly because of the density that we found in Kampala, because the density even of type A settlements is much higher than, for example, this one is gone, sorry. I would have loved to show you Arua, where you have a type A, which is, much less, sorry, a type B, where you have lower middle class people living, which is comparable to the type A in Kampala. In other words, people in Arua still have a lot of space to their residential areas. What we did also is we looked into land biographies, as in trying to understand the transaction as a process, where we identified different buyers and sellers and tried to break down the different aspects and attributes of the process. How, for example, the buyer was looking out for a specific broker or for a specific area of land. How people would make their choice, locational choice, and also how, of course, the whole process would work in terms of facilitation from government or more obstacles from government. So we had a number of very subjective, of course, but also very revealing, very insightful land biographies that helped us to understand how people would engage in land markets. From the conclusions in the land biographies, we found it interesting to see, first of all, that there is a big difference between so there is a very localized understanding of the market, and there is even in the same country a lot of difference. For example, and Astrid might know this very well, Arua and Kampala have a very different constitution of land and land markets. So, for example, in Arua you have a conflict emerging between customary and statutory tenure, while in Kampala you only have Milo land, which is King's land, which also in itself represents a problem for land ownership or a challenge for titling, etc. But it is in a more functional way, maybe organizable. Same for Hargeisa and Berbera, quite a difference in how people would react and act to it. But what I think also I saw it in David's, in Gordon's slides, Hargeisa, Berbera very strongly clan dominated. So you have this as an underlying level or an underlying element for all land transactions in both cities. And now, okay. Jumping into our last work package research method, that was the household survey. We did actually very intensive and across the city household survey with a few thousands of households per city. You can see the dots in Kampala and Hargeisa where we interviewed people. And that was very revealing in many ways, because it did not really confirm our hypothesis that we had, for example, in terms of spatial justice, that people in certain areas of the city would complain about their lack of access to services, or that they are not happy, not satisfied with where they are. But rather the opposite. That was one of the findings that we found very interesting, is that people reported always 80%, we're talking about not always, but 80% of all people interviewed were reporting that they are highly or well satisfied with their location, which then made us think, if people are happy now, that does mean maybe that they have different aspirations for the future. So their current location maybe matches well with their self-perceived social status and their self-perceived demands or their self-defined demands. While in the future they also want to move out, which was then also confirmed by another research question or interview question we had in the survey, which was, how do you see your prospects to stay in that area? Would you like to move out or would you like to continue? So another big number, over 60% of the people confirmed that they are actually wanting to move out of the area. 60% of all different income levels, which was also interesting. So as an average, slightly less in the higher segments of like higher income segments, but many people, most people actually confirmed that they would like to move somewhere else within the same city, which then also confirmed what you can see here, that let's first talk about this, the land accessibility. That rental is the most important means of accessing land in all cities, and if you take out people that are born in that specific plot, or on this, they've lived there all their lives, they've been born there, or they had no other choice than moving there. If you take all of these people out, you would find that most people actually want to rent. If you see here the tenure choice, this is very revealing to see how many people would like to rent. I just go back to this one on the household gender, which I said before briefly. Interesting was to see that female-headed households appear to be disadvantaged, which was not so surprising. But then they pay more for procedural costs, and they have less interest. Not only they have less registered titles in the sample collected, but they also showed less interest in having a title, for that very reason that a land title would mean for them that they, in the formalization process, they would have to pay more money also then for services, etc. How am I with time? I think I'm terrible. Astrid? Hello? Are you
Sorry, it's
still
taking me
there?
a while to unmute my mic. Yeah, just 2 more minutes. If we could wrap up in sort of 2 minutes, then we can open up for conversation.
Okay. Well, I try. I try the impossible. I wanted to make a few. Then let me just jump on this. Yeah, I think that the most relevant for the discussion about the city as a system is that we then try to create a spatial justice index out of all our different findings, seeing the locational choices of people, seeing their residential mobility, that they want to move within the city, that they see a relation between their, so to say, their career mobility, their moving forward, moving up within society, moving up in their career, and their locational choice, because this seemed to be quite important for people to have an option to move to a different plot. And then, of course, the question of what kind of services do you have, and what is the level of your access to services, or the possibility of closeness to the city, your mobility, the way you commute in the city, etc. So this is a spatial justice index, and I fear I will not have time enough to explain that. Just to explain how it is composed, it's a composition of different aspects, maybe better in here. We have a value of location that is determined actually by the land brokers and by a quite difficult to understand or to capture, as because it's also not very logic in itself, but the value of location as determined by the context. Then this is combined with the level of services that is provided to the specific location. And then up here, what is provided by the people themselves. In other words, if there is a lack of public services, people would build their own pit latrine, people would, as David pointed out, would buy their own water, etc. So this is a substitute of the lack of public services, and down here we have the transaction costs that are also differently high. So the whole thing together provides the price of purchase, and then in a comparison of different neighborhoods, you can see that this one is a well-located, quite expensive and well-serviced, publicly serviced plot. And this is a plot where the services are provided, but only partially by the public sector and mainly by the settlers themselves. So also the location is in itself quite expensive, and also the purchasing cost is quite significant. This one is lacking. There is not enough services provided, not even substituted, so there is insufficient services. Location is cheap, as considered to be insufficient, but then the transaction costs actually seem to be very high in comparison, or they were very high in comparison to the land value. Good.
Can I ask you to
yes.
conclude?
Yes. I think what we found in terms of, this is just a spatial channel. Okay. One thing for concluding about the land markets, they are definitely a very significant part of the system, but to put it in a catchphrase, land markets are offering solutions to the problems they have created, because land markets deal with the limited land that there is in the city, so they just distribute, and they distribute also the disadvantages. And I like what John said before, the benefits of this functionality. Actually, 2 years ago, we did a research on Mozambique and came up with an article that had exactly that type of the benefits of this functionality, that people would benefit from the insufficient provision of services within an area, which means they can purchase it. But then, of course, they have the non-benefits, the disadvantages of these dysfunctionalities for long. And I think that is a good ending and opening for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Alex. Another very interesting presentation on cities that I know very well, and land systems that I try to understand better, that are complex enough that one has to spend a long time to even begin to unpack what they mean. So I think, I like to start just with what you ended with, which is how can complex land markets potentially offer the solutions to the problems that they've created, and sort of draw that back to sort of Gordon's presentation and this question of land and its interaction with, for example, informal settlements. Alex, you mentioned our well-known Milo land here in Kampala, and one of the things that anyone who visits Kampala will see is that all our the majority of informal settlements are located on Milo land, particularly because the tenure system allows for dual ownership structure for the landowner and for the settler on the land. And so how do these sort of land tenure systems also drive growth? And in a sense, bringing it to John's point about the sort of city region, how do these land tenure systems influence the region, or the city region, or how we define it? And then your point right at the beginning, Alex, where you were saying, land titling has not necessarily brought the benefits or been as hyped up, brought the benefits as hyped up to be, particularly for particular segments of society. I think this harks very much back to sort of David's presentation, that particularly in the context of such complex land systems, it's probably the local solutions that are going to be the ones that are going to sort of help unleash these what you called solutions to the problems that have been created. I think also your household survey was very interesting in highlighting the question of dynamism that John reflected on, with over 60% saying that they wanted to move, and also the majority renting, and the sense of permanence, right? And so you were talking about your spatial justice index at the end, and I'm sorry we didn't have more time to go into it, but I wonder about this sort of dynamic nature, and then people's relation to their sense of place and people's relation to services. And as someone who works in municipal finance, what are people's relations to paying taxes, for example, for these services, if they don't see themselves sort of permanently within the city? And then finally, and I think from this, I'll open it up to everyone, and I'll go through the questions that everyone has put in the chat. Thank you very much. But it has been alluded to in some of the presentations, but I think it would be good to bring this out a little bit more in the discussion, is the role that politics and overall political settlements plays in all of this. Alex, I noticed in your land biography, and apologies if I didn't see it properly on the slide, but you had sort of a number of different actors who are interacting within the sort of land transaction system. But it was very fascinating to me that, you know, it seemed to be that the only judicial representative that you had in that sort of system was a notary. Yet, you know, when land transactions happen in Uganda, the fund starts after the transaction has happened, because then it usually goes to court. In fact, most of the court cases here have to do with land matters, and that's because of the very inherent political nature of land. And I think when we think about cities as systems and all these sort of interactions between the systems, and thinking about solutions, and thinking about Africa more generally, East Africa more specifically, and the urbanization part, sort of we can't ignore the sort of the politics that underpins a lot of what's been discussed today. So thank you to all our four presenters. I'm going to pick a couple of questions from the chat, because we don't have as much, we have 20 minutes for discussion. And let me start with Francis's question, given he was the first person to put a question in the chat box. And Francis had a question for Gordon, in which he asks, how does the projected high rates of urbanization for East African cities, for example, Nairobi is projected to nearly double by 2030, affect agglomeration economies thinking, if at all? And do agglomeration economies have the ability to keep up? So I'm going to, actually, let me group the questions. And also, if you have any responses to any of the comments I made, then we can sort of take each one of you in turn. So there's a question to Gordon, and a question to David was, please can you elaborate on examples from Nairobi and Hawassa, and how these relate to different land tenure systems? So, you know, to what Alex essentially was discussing in his last presentation, and in Nairobi being mostly privately owned land and Hawassa being government-owned land. I'm going to pick a question for John's presentation, which is, you know, if we understand cities as complex systems, this seems to require an equally, if not much more complex agenda for research and policy. It seems, and it would seem beyond the capacity of individual researchers or policymakers to understand and perhaps integrate this thinking into their work, given they're often trained in one discipline. So speaking to your question about the lack of multidisciplinarity, so what practical approaches do you recommend to coordinate these ideas across the disciplines? And then to the last presentation, to Alex's presentation, there was a comment here that also harks back to David's point about the lack of data, and the fact that, you know, a lot of your research across the four presentations has actually collected very interesting data, and whether there's potential opportunities to combine data between projects, and Kampala was given as an example, given that that's a city where more than one project has been working, and to see whether there's an overlap between desirability of areas and air pollution. And perhaps if we broaden that a little bit more, Alex, for you, is where you see, you know, you carried out a number of household surveys in the four cities that you mentioned, but where you see the future of sort of data for cities and data for urbanization, which, you know, to be useful for policymakers and for researchers needs to keep up with the speed of urbanization, where you see that going. So I pose these four questions and also open up for the presenters to respond to any of the points I made. Maybe if we start backwards this time, so maybe Alex, if you want to start.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, thanks for wrapping up. I'm happy that I couldn't deliver my message despite that I got a bit lost in too many slides. To answer that question, first of all, I think most of us know that there is only this one overlap that we have because just Kampala was selected twice in the research proposals, and all other cities don't have just one research team. So we had been discussing with William before also and the team in Birmingham. I think it would be really interesting to combine and see the different perception levels and satisfaction, etc., because I think we have also similar questions maybe asked and maybe even similar areas investigated. So yeah, I think it would be worth the extra effort for combining this data and see if we can mutually inform us and our research. But for data for urbanization, I have to be honest, I have a bit of an anti-researcher research approach. I think data for urbanization is not as needed as research on policies, to put it that way, because we often tend to just survey data on the ground while we are not researching, in my understanding, sufficiently on the actions and what they produce, because we see that there is a number of urban policies, for example, in Kampala and any other city as well. There's a number of urban policies that have their contribution and their impacts on the shape of the city and on the further urbanization, etc. But often we would look only on, for example, informal settlement upgrading as a singled out approach, and we would have our comments and our observations, but we would not look so much into the complexity of the outcomes of such intervention on a city scale, and also what it would mean to improve the policies. But that's my own opinion. Handing over.
Thanks, Alex. John, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I do have thoughts. So this particular issue has been at the forefront of the University of Birmingham for the last 7 or 8 years. And part of this is so the University of Birmingham was founded in 1900 as a university to integrate and provide support for local businesses and local people. It was very much had a local place-based agenda. And then as higher education has become more national and more international, the university has had a tension between being one can be a global university versus being a local university. And for a period, it forgot its local roots in Birmingham and sort of turned its back on the city. And about 15 years ago, there was a discussion across the university to re-engage and become a locally engaged university, as well as being a global player within higher education. Now, one outcome of that was the development of the City Region Economic Development Institute. So this is an institute that sits outside any department. It reports directly to the Vice Chancellor. It contains a group of multidisciplinary researchers. Our objective study is city regions. And what we have within the City Region Economic Development Institute, there are geographers, there are economists, there are applied economists, there are sociologists, there are planners, there are policymakers, you name it. We forget about disciplinary boundaries, and every month, every day, what's happening within the City Region Economic Development Institute becomes much more complex. And what we've been trying to do is educate local policymakers into understanding the complex interrelationships between different parts of the system that go on within the West Midlands. One example of that is that the West Midlands has a major skills gap problem. It also has a major housing issue in terms of housing shortages. So there's a group of academics who just work on the skills issue. There's another group of academics who work on the housing issue. They are obviously completely interrelated. So if you want to develop a solution to the skills problem, you have to also develop a housing housing solution, because the reason why we have localized skills shortages is partly because we have localized housing shortages. So all the attempts to develop solutions to skills have failed in the past because they haven't been doing what they should be doing, is developing an integrated solution that covers housing and skills policies and combines them together. So I'm conscious that within Birmingham, City Ready, the City Region Economic Development Institute, is an unusual solution to try and address the complexity and the multidisciplinary nature of city regions. You can copy and follow us. The alternative is to make sure that any projects that are involving city regions have a multidisciplinary component. And it's a real active multidisciplinary component rather than something which is more token.
Thanks, John. David?
Hi, thank you. On the issue of complexity, it's really difficult for external agencies to do upgrading well. It's difficult to get data. There is no data. There are no maps. There's no official data. The informal settlement dwellers are very suspicious of outsiders coming in and asking questions, and will often chase them out, fearing that they're to legitimate a bulldozing. And of course, it's incredibly complex, and as all of our research is showing. But make the solution local, where you've got organized groups of the urban poor, such as the Kenyan Homeless People's Federation. They will work with the inhabitants of any settlement to do the mapping, to do the enumeration, to gather the data. They also do impossible negotiations. Everyone said that in Nairobi, the fight between tenants and landlords in all the informal settlements just preclude any solution. Yet with the help of the Federation, they've negotiated in several settlements agreements between landlords and tenants where everyone gets accommodation. This kind of links to the question about data. Official data collecting systems in Africa and much of Asia are so national or state government focused. The census authorities don't see local governments as, key customers for their work. So it seems the only way to do it is to generate the data at the city level. And again, you go back to the competence of the federations of the urban poor in Kampala, as well as in Kampala and several other Ugandan cities, as well as in Nairobi and several other Kenyan cities, to gather the data needed to provide the maps, to provide details on who lives in each place, to provide details on priorities. On the difference between Hawassa and Nairobi, Hawassa, the dormitories are only being discussed at the moment. I don't think there's any large-scale program to actually build them yet. And it may be linked to the enterprises in that a large part of the population who are meant to be housed in these dormitories is single women who form such an important part of the workforce. In Nairobi, these 8 to 10 story tenement buildings are kind of formal, even if they contravene quite a lot of regulations about provision for water and sanitation and overcrowding and so on and so on. I think what's happening in Nairobi at a scale that took us all by surprise is happening pretty much everywhere, where informal settlements have some certainty about not being bulldozed and where ownership is clear, they build up. And, I was recently in Buenos Aires, and there's this famous informal settlement where everyone's building 4 to 6 story buildings because they feel secure there. Sorry, that's it.
Hi, yes. Well, I'll try to answer a couple of questions. So the first one related to agglomeration economies and whether they were being used up by the rapid urbanization. And I guess, it was a question I tried to touch on in the presentation. To some extent, agglomeration economies aren't that sort of thing that gets used up. And if you look at it from the point of view of the pull of the cities, of course, the fact that a city like Dar es Salaam has been growing at 6% a year, at least between the last two censuses, and pulling people in from the countryside suggests that for some people that they see the economic advantages or other advantages that could be translated to economic terms of coming to the city. I think it is important, as came up a bit before, to recognize that movement of people is a net movement. It's not that people just pick up sticks in the rural areas and come to the city, and often they're very aware of what they're getting themselves into as they move back and forth. So it's not, as used to be described more than it is now, a case of people coming to the city not aware of what the cities were like, although of course they're taking their chances and the outcomes are very uncertain. But I guess from the point of view of, to move on to the next question, really, with the issue that was brought up about the Venables Collier sort of notion of unleashing formal property systems. I think, what I was trying to get at was that the logic of it makes sense, and I think a lot of the analysis behind it and the theory behind it is interesting, but it does end up very partial, and I think some of the partiality of it does relate to things like does relate to the fact that cities are complex systems, and that something like informality is not just a manifestation of a tenure system. It's a phenomenon that's taken place in cities around the world. The place where informality is meant to be much smaller has been China, where we had extremely rapid urbanization and much less informal settlement. But I think you have to recognize, if you look at that from a systems point of view, that what they created were informal people rather than informal settlements. And that to some extent, in terms of the political economy of cities, that played the same role, although it had different consequences for development. But in terms of the idea of a transition, and I think this holds across at least most of the projects that were done here, are recognizing that the idea that you just would switch from an informal to a formal system through a small set of policy changes is not terribly realistic, I think if you take something like the approach of the new urban economics as presented by Venables and Collier and others, but they're particularly keen on this notion of formal land and property markets. And I think one interesting thing is that, of course, De Soto was very much for them a number of years ago. And what's interesting, I think, is on the one hand, he was coming at it from what amounts to an economic point of view, but he was using a very, very different argument, but coming up with the same conclusion. And I do think there's something in the economic logic that tends towards that conclusion of trying to release the efficiency of markets, even though if you look at the details of their analysis, they do recognize the problem. And in fact, some of the critiques of the informal development that they give relate to the fact that it is a smooth market mechanism in a city where you have coordination problems that mean that smoothly functioning markets create problems. So I think it's just to get an example of some of the issues that come up. If you look at Dar es Salaam, a city that's been relatively favorable historically, now no longer so much, but towards informal development. So it's not illegal, and informal landholders have certain rights, and there's relatively less contestation around that in many of the areas. And a lot of the contestation does occur when, and it doesn't seem to matter that much whether the land is formalized or not, but when you have different land uses that don't go well together, so you have commercialization of residential neighborhoods and there's very little guidance over that process, you get all sorts of difficulties coming up that are not just questions of creating smoothly functional markets, because markets don't function very smoothly when you have all these local externalities or agglomeration diseconomies and economies that make it so that a neighborhood that's good for one sort of activity is not so good for another. And that relates, I'm just going to, just to turn it over to another issue that's come up, sort of air pollution and whether that relates to issues of housing. And I think it's an interesting one. And again, just to get back to this issue of the systems perspective, what you expect is not that is not that bad air pollution would simply create a situation where you end up getting relatively poor people living, although that mechanism certainly, that cause and effect certainly exists, but it would be combined with a whole set of other processes that mean that these problematic issues around local neighborhood effects, negative spatial effects tend to come together. And there too, I mean, there's a certain economic logic to it, even if it is external to the market, so that, when you had that, I don't know whether anybody remembers Larry Summers once saying that, well, poor people's lives are, he said it jokingly, he meant to say it jokingly, he got attacked, of course, but saying, look, poor people's lives are worth less, so it makes sense to put polluting industries in poor countries. But his point was that actually that is the logic of a lot of the analysis that's done, even if nobody wants to draw that conclusion, because that is the way the market will operate. And if you did cost-benefit analysis in a simple way, you would conclude it would be willingness to pay to avoid pollution is less in poor neighborhoods. But in any case, whether you, even if policymakers are not prepared to accept that, that's part of the process that happens, and you get these things clustering together. Well, I think it'd be very interesting to look at, but I don't
Gordon,
think
can I just interrupt you, because we have only 3 minutes left, and I wanted to just throw out one final question to any one of the 4 presenters who wants to answer it, which is the sort of forward-looking agenda, right? Where do we see the cities and systems research going? I think we saw a number of overlaps between the sort of models and conceptualizations used between the different presenters and the different sort of research studies here. But do we see that, in the future, we will have sort of multiple different systems-based models that draw on different disciplines and are applied to specific city contexts? So is this sort of, do you see the models becoming very city-specific? Or do you see us sort of eventually narrowing towards one or a few preferred approaches and models that are, that are used across various spatial and policy contexts? I won't, any one of the 4 presenters who wants to sort of tackle that question, but sort of so that we leave everyone with sort of where's the forward-looking agenda in this sort of cities as systems research?
It's David. I'd be happy to give a quick comment.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
What we see in Mukuru that I didn't really have a chance to talk about is unprecedented. It's 105,000 households in a small area of Nairobi, heavily contested land ownership and use. And yet the Kenyan Federation of Women's Savings Groups basically is negotiating a solution. And they've done this before in other settlements, informal settlements in Nairobi. And it's going on in 30, 31, 32 other nations around the world. If low-income groups are organized, they have tremendous capacity to negotiate solutions that work. And they're not asking for formalization, but what they're asking for is to move the formal rules and regulations towards something that's more affordable. So we actually get, in a sense, a new set of rules and regulations that make it possible for low-income groups to be part of the formal sector. But it's important that they negotiate that and set that particular change. In Windhoek, they slash the minimum size of land plots, and suddenly 3/4 of the urban poor could afford a legal land plot. There's all sorts of ways of addressing the systems of housing, systems of land, systems of finance, systems of infrastructure, systems of services, so they better work with informal settlements.
Since we started a couple of minutes late, I will indulge perhaps one more response. Alex, I see your microphone is on. Yep.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I think that the really, it's even a philosophical question, highly appreciated. I wonder how we will have to deal with cities in future, because we have to recognize that due to the complexity, cities are also performing very individually, and there is no standard solution to anything. So it will be the more we embrace the notion of complexity, the less we will be able to transfer our findings and lessons to other cities. So I think it's very difficult to come to a systemic understanding, a systemic approach, without considering these localities. And as said, it's a philosophical question that is not possible to be answered. And I like actually the complexity paradox to illustrate with this famous notion about India. India is so complex. Everything you can say about India, the opposite is also true. And I think that also links to what Gordon said before, what other people said, that the moment we study the phenomenons and we understand that to everything there is a different answer possible, we will also understand that, for example, land tenureship is definitely not reduced to informality alone. Land tenureship, or sorry, the other way around, informality is something that is a sphere or a phenomenon that we have to continue studying, but locally, to understand how it impacts on the local settings. But yeah, as said, there is no closed answer to that question.
On that, I like to, sorry, just cognizant of everyone's time, but I like to end on open questions, because that means that the discussion will keep going. And I think Gordon, David, John, and Alex, you've really given us a lot of food for thought, both in your presentations and now in the discussion afterwards. And I want to thank you for taking the time for presenting today, and thank you to the University of Birmingham for hosting this fascinating webinar. But you know, as Alex correctly put it, this is still a very sort of up in the air question, and as John said, you know, a research agenda that requires a number of different disciplines to come together, and in particular, as David noted, including the people, and including the people who are really impacted by the agenda. And you know, sort of bringing it back to where we started with Gordon, which is that, you know, we really have to think of this agenda as one that is all inclusive, complex, and involves a number of different interactions that lead to a number of different outcomes, and perhaps thinking about things that researchers have said before. And have sort of worked on before, but thinking about them in different ways and putting them in different lights. When we think about African cities, and particularly East African cities, and to sort of promote this agenda of inclusive urbanization. So thank you everyone for joining us today. This webinar will be uploaded, and a copy of the recording will be sent and circulated to participants via Twitter and email. And I hope that we can convene again soon, either collectively as a group or sort of more individually, to carry these discussions forward and to really sort of drive this agenda, both from a research but also from a policy perspective. So thank you everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you very much for hosting. That was nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.